We'll get started if everybody can take a seat. Our next speaker is Wes Widner. Wes is from over in the Atlanta area, and he's going to talk to us about At the Mountains of Malware, lessons learned from analyzing terabytes of malware. Y'all all welcome Wes.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm Wes Widner. I work with the Norse Corporation, and this talk is basically the culmination of everything I wish I'd have been told when I first started on this project. And the reason why it's given here at BSides is because if you want to set up your own pipeline system, these are pretty much all the elements that you'll need. Now, to start off with, though, need to go back and talk about what the pipeline is. So, in any Norse is in the threat intelligence business, so mining indicators of compromise out of malware is basically the charter that was given. So we basically need to divide it up into three parts. Sorry, these slides aren't going to have a whole lot of information, so the handout on this address, and I'll also tweet this out if anybody wants it later, that's all of my notes and all of the links and everything else to be able to put all this together on your own. So to go back to it, the pipeline can be broadly divided into three parts, or at least the malware pipeline. There's sources. You got to go find the malware, find samples to look at. Then mining those pieces of malware for information. And then finally, generating intelligence based on the information that you mine, because just mining the information out it's interesting, but it doesn't constitute intelligence. So, with that in mind, the purpose of the pipeline is, initially it was to get the analyst as far down the track of doing their job as I could. So there's a lot of things that we could go ahead and do for them, like pulling out the strings, pulling out file types, correlating the malware samples, because we don't need to have, analysts can take quite a while to analyze one piece of malware, so we don't need to, we want them to, each one be focused on a different type of malware. It's one of the main goals. Another thing for your own personal edification is, if you want to set up for yourself, you probably want to have a pipeline. I'm putting one together myself just for Mac malware. It's very rare, but it's pretty interesting. Also, Linux malware. Just to give you a scope of this, what we ended up with in the end, the talk says terabytes of malware. Right now we're at 25 terabytes of malware. So, and that's from various different sources, running about 250,000 samples a day. So it's a lot of sludge through the pipes. So first thing is to help analysts go through and do as much of their job automatically as possible. Second is to generate some sort of intelligence off of the information that we gather. Well, like I said, the first part is sources. You can't really have a pipeline if all you have is a trickle of data coming in. So we started with spam feeds coming in and just pulling the URLs off of that. That constitutes the organic feeds. There's two broad types of sources that we found. One is organic and the other is synthetic. The organic feeds are the ones that you find live malicious URLs. These are pretty rare. And it's also pretty hard to pull malware off of them for two reasons. One, most of the big guys like Cisco and some of these other threat companies, sorry about that. They tend to pull these samples down as fast as they come up. So it's really hard to find a live organic URL that's still serving malware. The second reason it's really hard, malware tends to want to not be found. So when you go and you just do a low interaction crawl, just like a curl get, most malware will actually be hiding in a server. We had a talk earlier about compromised servers. Most malware works in concert with the servers so that it will require you to interact with it in a certain way before it releases the malware payload. So for that we have to build Custom crawlers, there's a honey client that's out there that's really good called Thug, and just coaxing the malware out of these organic sources is pretty hard. There's several vendors that supply organic URL threat feeds. Some of those will give them to you for free if you're doing personal research, some of them won't. What we also found is that measuring these feeds, for the organic feeds, it's a measurement of yield. So are they stale? Are they giving us stale URLs? Are they giving us a bunch of URLs from one single domain? Stuff like that. Also with the crawling, you can't. We learned early on you have to throttle the crawling of the URLs to pull these out. Otherwise, they get kind of aggravated. We've gotten some nasty letters for that. The second type, so the organic URLs aren't going to give you a whole lot. The most we ever got was maybe 1,000, 2,000 a day. And that's after crawling hundreds of thousands. So the yield there is if you got a 20% yield, that's really good from what I've seen. The last thing to note about the organic sources, you actually get a lot of context information from this. Server information, the IPs, the related IPs, like you get a lot of contextual information from organic URLs. So when you find them, they're really useful. Trouble is, it's kind of like mining for gold. You have to crush a whole lot of rock to get just a little tiny bit of gold. So then we started supplementing our feed with synthetic sources. Synthetic sources are malware rollups. One of the best sources of malware rollups is VirusShare out of Georgia Tech. Just giant multi-gig dumps. Now these are kind of, the ones that they offer are occasional. They've gotten a lot better recently. It's more like 14 gigs every other week or so. We also have other sources that were able to give us maybe 40 gigs or so a day. Once again, paid, public. I think you'd be able to set up a pretty decent system on your own just on the public sources. So with the synthetic feeds, we don't get context information, but what we do get usually is the analysis that's already been done by the company or whoever it was that found the malware out in the wild. And what that'll do is that will help us later when we go to train classifiers. The synthetic feeds provide us with like the family, the malware family. They'll usually bundle virus total information in with our feed. Oh, and hash and all that, but you can calculate that on your own. So the second main pipe is features. This is the mining part of data mining. So one of the exciting parts about this entire pipeline is that it deals with analysis of malware, and also it leads into the big data and machine learning fields. So it kind of combines all the hot, new, exciting things. That said, mining the data out of malware, mining information out in general is the unsexy part of the job. And this is where the bulk of activity is gone. So there's effectively three parts in the mining process. There's what I would call a surface scan, static analysis, and dynamic analysis. So you can kind of lump the surface and static scans together. The difference being the surface analysis is just looking at the bits on disk, not doing anything with it, just looking at strings. This is where you pull strings information out. You look at, if it's a PE file, the PE headers, or you can parse the various different file types in their own ways. The idea for this is to be really, really fast, and each one of these gets progressively slower. So static analysis is after this. The difference with static analysis is we're actually pulling apart the malware. So most malware is packed, kind of like an installer that you would install an application with. Malware is packaged and distributed in about the same way. The difference, though, is software that you install from an EXE or an MSI, those tend to want to help you out and provide all the tools that they have. Malware doesn't want you. There's always a race of them trying to find packers that aren't well known versus companies like ours or the ones that we work with, unpacking the malware and coming up with a whole list there. So, static analysis, the big part of that is unpacking it. And so, in order to make sense of that, you're going to have a really good system to correlate all the different files, because generally, malware authors face the same problem as software development in general, except they're in an actively hostile environment. So what that means is, once you unpack a file, you'll probably have a lot of correlation between, in similarities. Another thing is, another tactic that they're fond of is taking a really big installer like Steam or a Steam game, and then just inserting a little bit of malware at the end. So just looking at the hash for the file is not going to really help. You really need to parse it all apart and say, this is the interesting bit. Once again, there's a vast majority of stuff that's not interesting. There's like 10, 20% that really is. The last type of feature generation is the most flashy, but I would argue the least scalable. Many companies have tried to get this right. There's VMray and I forget the other companies off the top of my head, but there's several, or VirusTotal does this too. Taking a malware sample, and you have usually a virtual machine. You detonate the sample, detonate meaning execute the sample inside of the dynamic analysis, and monitor everything around it. This is also effectively what companies like McAfee, Microsoft, who's partnered with VirusTotal, CrowdStrike, and Carbon Black. They all do this on their customers' machines, but we're doing it in the lab. Now, the reason why they're doing it on their customer machines is because malware, once again, doesn't want to run. Because if we can automatically analyze it, then we can generate Yara rules or snort rules or whatever and automatically block it. So there's a whole anti-virus community that's there. So they will look for things like whether or not your computer has more than one CPU, because most computers sold today have more than one CPU. Whether it has a hard drive bigger than 40 gigs. If I'm setting up everything in my data center, which I did initially, I want to give everything as small a slice of disk space as possible so that I can have a lot of VMs running. Well, they know that. So what they'll do is they'll detect these indicators and they'll just stop executing. And so you don't get any of the good information. So there's two ways around that. You could either patch the malware itself, which I have a link to a really interesting paper on that, or you can change your environment to look like a consumer, someone's PC. And actually, there's all kinds of products. Some of the companies I was thinking about, they have, this is where all the heavy lifting is. They'll put in things like moving the mouse for you or jumping ahead in time, because some malware will just wait for a couple of days. Because they know that if they wait a day or two, the user, a regular user, will still be using their system. But somebody like me who's doing dynamic analysis, we've moved on to the next sample, the next one, the next one. So things like there's a whole project called PA-Fish that's pretty much the industry standard. If you can get that to pass, then you have a good, clean environment to run a dynamic sample in. The problem, though, is there's a lot of indicators that can give you away. Like, most of the time when you install a VM, you also want to install, or most of us do, install the tools, the guest tools that come with VMware or VirtualBox. That's a dead giveaway. But more than that, the CPU version number, you can query for that. There's certain hidden features in the hypervisors that give away virtual environment. Now, malware used to be very averse to virtual environments altogether, But there's several papers that have shown that malware used to not run in virtual environments, and then about 4-5 years ago, they started running again because proliferation of things like moving servers to cloud and virtualized workstations, stuff like that. But they still want to make sure that a human is on the other end. That's why the new thing is moving the mouse, or malware will actually have a sort of CAPTCHA system where they want you to authenticate before the virus will actually run. As weird as it sounds, so some of the features we get off of dynamic analysis. We've got all the processes that were run, of course, all the network information that it generates, what's called dropped files, the persistence of the persistent part of the infection. You've got registry keys that were edited, libraries that were called, because malware will actually try to import as few libraries as possible, usually, and then dynamically load everything else. So if you're statically analyzing it, you'll have 3 or 4 libraries that it has a hard reference to. The rest of them are loaded at runtime after the program's unpacked itself and decrypted portions that it needs to be able to pull in everything else. So all of this information, now we've got it stored in some large processing platform, usually Hadoop, something like that. Now is for the intelligence part. Now, there's a lot that's gone on as far as machine learning, big data, stuff like that, but there's really only 2 focuses that I've seen most people use. One is clustering, so that we want to, I said that we got 250,000 new samples in a day. The vast majority of that is just repackaged stuff. It's the same stuff over and over and over again. So what we want to do is be able to cluster the malware, and there's several techniques for that. And if you're researching, you probably want to find thin clusters that don't have a lot of members in it, because those are going to be the more interesting ones to go to. Depends on what your focus is. The second, clustering, and the second and last part of it is prediction. So prediction is also classification. It's a form of classification. Think of it as if you're ordering something from Amazon and it has the "you might also like this thing," that's effectively that would be the clustering. Classification is probably good, probably bad. And this is where I said earlier, if you've got a synthetic feed, they will actually tell you in the synthetic feed what's good and bad. This is where you can add that in as sort of a reinforcement learning. So, what you do with the malware after this point, generating Yara rules or Snort or whatever, what I've found after having worked on this and stumbled through a lot of these areas is that there's actually a lot of different applications, and it's not just confined to the threat intelligence industry. So if you're running network operations, using Snort, you get your files through there. You probably want to run it through a similar system. Probably surface scanning, fingerprinting it, and then going from there. So that's really all I've got, and I want to leave a lot of time open for questions, because I'm sure if you're interested in setting one up, there's a lot of tools to help. So with that, any questions? Just as a way of survey, who's actually done manual analysis of malware before? Has anybody ever tried to automate that process? Nobody? Okay. This is a really, like I said, it's a pretty hot field, especially for threat intelligence in the threat intelligence industry. And there's a lot of gotchas there. All right. Well, if there's no questions, then oh yes.
The URL for the handout?
Sure. I'll also tweet this out later, along tagging the conference on Twitter. So there's several ways to get it. All right. Thank you guys for your time.